Welcome to our webinar today. We're going to be talking about thinking strategically about your career negotiations. I am Hannah Riley Bowles, and I'm delighted to have been invited here by the Harvard Alumni Association to have this session with you all today. I want to alert you that as we have this conversation, please check out the chat box and contribute to it. I've already got some responses here indicating that we've got folks tuning in from California, Massachusetts, Virginia, Illinois, Texas, from Canada, Chile, Brazil, Portugal, the UK, and I'm thrilled to be able to share this time with you all. I am a Harvard alumni as well. I have degrees from the Kennedy School and the Harvard Business School, and I'm married to an alum of the college. But I've also been teaching at the Harvard Kennedy School since 2001. So I've had the honor and joy of working with students from all across the university, from the Kennedy School, the Business School, the Med School, Divinity, School of Public Health, Ed School, the college, and a variety of other folks. So I know from some emails that I got that there may be some familiar faces out there. And for those of you I haven't met, I'm very happy that we get to spend this time together. So let's dive in. What I'd like to start off with first is a little bit of a conversation about images of women's leadership advancement to frame our conversation today. So the classic image of women's leadership advancement or barriers to women's leadership advancement is the glass ceiling. But in the past 10 years, those of us who study women's leadership advancement and teach about it have moved away from the glass ceiling imagery to imagery of a labyrinth. And you have here the book cover of Alice Eagley and Linda Carley's book, Through the Labyrinth. And the idea of moving to the imagery of the labyrinth is that there are women making it now into top leadership positions. It's not that there are perfect barriers that don't allow women's ascension, but it is a more complicated road for women to those top positions, and even more broadly for women's career advancement than it is for men in many respects. And so the idea of the labyrinth is to think about what those barriers and complexities are. And so what I want to invite you to do today is, as we think about gender and negotiation and gender and career negotiation, is to get up above the labyrinth. What I'd like to do is expose you to some of the research related to gender and negotiation and to some extent women's leadership advancement, and want to use that as a kind of analytic frame, not to think about disadvantages like things that we own, but think about what are the barriers that might get in our way, what are the challenges that we might encounter, and then how do we strategize around them. So I very much hope that this is an empowering conversation. So what do I mean by career negotiations? When I refer to career negotiations, I'm talking about career-related conversations and requests that involve some problem-solving, creative options, trade-offs, or a conflict to be resolved. So I'm not thinking about simple requests where you would get a yes or no response. These are situations where you're proposing something and there's going to have to be some give and take or problem solving to figure them out. The classic example that comes to mind is the job offer. So I do have in mind those types of formal negotiations that we might engage in at organizational entry or promotion points. But I also want you to think about more everyday negotiation examples where we are trying to work out with others the roles that we're going to play, what our trajectory is in an organization, and also matters of workload and work life. So these negotiations, because I want you to think about yourselves as whole people, not just your interactions with employers, these negotiations may also involve domestic partners as well as work partners. So some of this is figuring out with our household partners, our loved ones, how we're going to meet all of our life's aspirations. So I want to show you an image. This image has become a bit of a muse for me lately in my research. And it's in part because I hate it. I worry so much about this image. It depicts, as I think you'll share in my impression, the image of a woman who is hesitant and debilitated, and you look forward and you say, oh, you know, we've got to give her confidence and we've got to give her skills. But if you remember only one thing from this conversation that we're having here today, I want you to remember that there are no predictable gender differences based simply on the gender of the person. So as a gender scholar, if I want to get my gender effects, I will not be able to publish gender effects. I won't get gender effects if all I do is invite men and women into my studies and bank on them acting differently. As we all experience in life, sometimes women are more competitive than men, sometimes men are more cooperative than women. Men and women don't stably behave in different ways, particularly in organizational behavior. There may be, you know, biologically grounded things when we get to, you know, infant care and violence. But when we're talking about organizational behavior or negotiation, the gender effects that we've observed are not really about the individual, they're about the context. The other reason why this image bothers me is that there's been a lot of discussion lately about if we could just teach women to negotiate, we could close the gender wage gap. You know, if it's just these women don't ask, and if we could just buck them up. And there's actually now negotiation training programs across the United States in cities trying to train women to negotiate for higher pay. Now, I think negotiation training is a great thing, and I've actually sat in on some of these programs, and I love the way these women are coming together to cheer each other on. But the idea that the gender wage gap is explained by women's reluctance to negotiate or their lack of confidence or skill is just not right. So I want to show you an image to motivate this conversation of you know, the last 30 or 40 years or so data on the gender wage gap. So I want to highlight what you're looking at here. So on the y-axis, what you're seeing is, as it says at the top, how much less women earn as compared to men by age for full-time wage and salary workers. So we're just focusing on full-time salaries. And what you'll see, so as the numbers go down, that means women doing less well than men. And then along the x-axis here on the bottom, you can say that's years. So they're reaching all the way back to 1979 through 2013. The other thing that I want to draw your attention to is the colors of the lines, because that's what represents the different age groups that they're capturing. And so what you see is that the gender wage gap for relatively young workers, 25 to 34, is smaller than for older full-time workers. And this age group, so is really what that image captures. I mean, that's where a lot of these studies that show women's reluctance relative to men to negotiate for pay are primarily looking at you know, younger workers at organizational entry. I think those are really important findings. Some of my research has contributed to them, but I don't want them to overstate the complexity of the gender wage gap. So if you look here, what you see is a meaningful gap between, or meaningful difference between the gap for younger workers and the gap for older workers. And what you see is that it is really, the gap widens as people reach midlife and then into later career. And the primary explanations for the dramatic wage gap and for that widening relates to career trajectories and the management of work-family dilemmas, as opposed to just whether you negotiated a few more $1,000s at organizational entry or a particular promotion point. So I'm not discouraging anyone from negotiating for a higher pay or when you got a new job or when you have a promotion, but what I'd like to do is broaden the conversation about career negotiations beyond pay. Pay is important, but what I also want to think about during this conversation is negotiating your role, right? So the scope of your work, the scope of your authority, changes in position that you might desire, or potential promotions. I also want to include in this conversation negotiations over developmental opportunities. So think about things like special assignments, tours of duties, or details, or your capacity to participate in conferences, or whether or not you have access to training or coaching. What are those things that would help enable you, better prepare you to take on the leadership positions to which you're aspiring? And then finally, also work-family conflicts. So this is also an important topic of negotiation. So how do we negotiate our workload or flexible work arrangements? And this is everything from our hours to where we work, the degree to which we travel, or if we take some form of family leave. Now, what the research suggests, as captured by that image that I showed you before, is that there is good evidence, replicated, numerous replications of this effect showing that men are more likely to negotiate compensation than women. I'm going to give you a deeper explanation of why that occurs a little bit later in this talk, but that has been shown. And it does not relate to simply to women's confidence or skill. It's actually a response to the social environment. Now, in terms of negotiations over role and developmental opportunities, this is where I've been focusing more of my attention in recent years. And the research that we've collected thus far has not indicated any gender differences in the propensity to negotiate over things like role or developmental opportunities. Now, in part, this is again going back to why would there be this gender difference in compensation. Negotiating for compensation, pay is very masculine stereotyped. It's associated with the male breadwinner, so it's counter-stereotypical for women. And I'll explain a little later why that would be inhibiting in a negotiation situation. Now, if you look at work-family conflicts, as I anticipate you all would recognize, women are significantly, the literature suggests, women are significantly more likely to be negotiating workload or leave or flexible work arrangements than men are. Now, some of this is the fulfillment of traditional roles, and women may be more inclined to do that than men, but there's also evidence showing that there are negative stereotypes around men trying to negotiate leave, and that men face a kind of not man enough backlash when they attempt to negotiate leave. So even when there are some studies that show that even when men and women are equally inclined or desiring of some sort of flexible work arrangement, men are more inhibited than women to negotiate those arrangements. And this has implications for the negotiations inside. Even if you have an equitable partnership and the women feel inhibited about negotiating for pay and the guy feels inhibited about negotiating for flexible work, that could have implications for the careers of partners in an equitable relationship. So let me keep going here. So I'm back to this image that I worry so much about, and one of the things that I want to do in this talk, but then also in my research going forward, is to develop a broader vision of women negotiating for things beyond pay in ways that help them achieve their career and life aspirations. Another thing that I'd like to highlight is that a lot of the research, as suggested by this image that I was a little resistant of earlier, that I remain resistant of, is that she's young, she's white, she's heteronormative, she's highly educated. I mean, a lot of the research on gender is very much about white privileged people. There isn't a ton of research on intersecting gender identities, and the research that is out there doesn't suggest that what I'm going to tell you today is a lot different for different types of women, but I welcome questions about that as we go forward. So one of the other things that I've learned from my research in recent years, where I've been trying to get out of the lab and actually talk to men and women about what they negotiate in their careers, is that we've discovered a pattern of 3 different types of career negotiations. And I want to highlight these because I think I know that in the group of you who are out there participating, that there's a diversity of things that you have in your mind. In fact, I see here on the monitor, I see people are thinking about negotiating pay raises, flexible work arrangements. How can I arrange to work from home? So I hear an echo, but I should just keep going. Okay. So There's negotiating within one's hierarchy of supervisors, so maybe that's about career advancement. Again, salary, balancing assertiveness and ambition. How do we expect women to act? I'll talk about this. And then how do you think about making a pitch, negotiating for career advancement? So we're going to talk about all these things. As you think about the examples that you have in your own mind, negotiations that are most relevant to you, I want to introduce you to 3 distinct types of negotiating strategies to see if because I think they might give you clarity as you develop your own negotiating strategy. So one is what I call asking. Now, asking, which comes from the women don't ask idea, relates to negotiations over standard opportunities or rewards. So asking does represent those types of negotiations, like the job offer negotiation, or where that you would have an organizational entry or certain promotion points. Another example of a standard negotiation topic in a lot of organizations is training opportunities or tours of duty or other types of developmental opportunities. In many organizations, there'll be a kind of periodic check-in about what types of opportunities you would like to take advantage of. In some organizations, people will check in with you on a kind of rotational basis about what is the next, say, types of project that you want to take on, or what your next leadership or managerial responsibility for be. So asking are these things that are standard conversations within your organization that are about the navigation of your career along established paths. As I mentioned before, the asking domain, particularly around pay, is where we have found the clearest evidence of men being more inclined to negotiate than women, and then sometimes also negotiating greater payoffs. The second category is something that's come out of our research, which is what we call bending. And I use the image, I should have explained, of a vending machine to describe asking, because asking negotiations are about the menu of things that people recognize as available that we can talk about within the organization. And not everybody wants the same things out of the vending machine. Not everybody gets the same deal, but we all have a sense of these are the appropriate or expected conversations. Bending negotiations are about when you get to the vending machine and what you want is not there. And what we have found, and this was actually a surprise that we only discovered after we had blind coded a lot of interviews for gender, was that we found in a number of contexts that women actually engage in more bending negotiations than men, or that they report more frequent reliance on bending than asking, in contrast to men. And as we've tried to dig more deeply into why that might be happening, we're discovering 2 reasons. One is that a lot of the bending negotiations, frankly, relate to these work-life conflicts. And so what'll be happening is that women will be in a work environment where you don't have a flexible work policy, or you don't have some sort of the person who had your job before never negotiated over the location or degree of travel or something like that. And so women are kind of bending the traditional career paths in order to balance their high aspirations both inside and outside of work. Now, there are pluses and minuses to doing that type of bending, right? So sometimes that bending is fabulous because it allows you to carve out a path to remain on track for where you want to go. Sometimes you can end up negotiating arrangements that take you away from looking like the ideal worker within the organization. So it could get in the way of the speed at which your career advances. That said, I think you want to think about whether that type of an arrangement, if it helps you achieve your life aspirations, that may be the right thing for you. For women who found themselves in a situation where they thought they had to leave the workplace because they couldn't make all of their aspirations work, again, I'd love them to think about, before you leave, think about whether there might be some arrangement that you could negotiate, some bending arrangement that hasn't existed before in the organization, but where you could achieve all of your aspirations. I'll quickly give you one example. There was a woman I was interviewing who was in one of the major professional services firm, and she wanted to arrange a part-time relationship with the firm, and they wouldn't give her that, but they ended up coming up with this creative arrangement where they started giving her clients that couldn't afford the very large firm services. And so she ended up actually working as an independent contractor for a while, providing high-level professional services to smaller businesses during a period of time when she needed flexibility, wanted to have control over her hours. And then once some of that tightness in her schedule was relieved, she ended up actually taking one of these smaller organizations public and had a very very prominent and high-level career. But anyways, I encourage you with the bending to think creatively. Some of it's around work-life. The other place where we saw the bending was with women who had non-traditional professional backgrounds. So for instance, there are some management positions or leadership positions in which everybody who's held that role has always been an engineer. But you don't actually need to be an engineer to do the role. If you think about IT, whether or not you have a computer science background. And there were a number of examples where women described negotiating their way into leadership opportunities where they didn't have the traditional qualifications for that job, but they were able to show through by say negotiating, give me 6 months and I'll show you X, or negotiating to get the support they needed or some extra assistance, for instance, maybe around some of those technical skills on which they were not as strong, in order to take on leadership positions that they wanted to take, even though they were non-traditional employees or candidates for that job. The final category here is shaping. And so, whereas asking and bending are really about individual arrangements that one would make within an organization, shaping is very much negotiating a leadership role, and not just negotiating something for yourself, but actually negotiating to change your organization. So this can be about saying, we should have a new business line, we should be reaching out to a new type of customer base or product set, or we should be moving into a new region, or this could be very entrepreneurial about creating a new type of organization. And so these negotiations are not just about negotiating somebody individually for yourself, but also more broadly about gaining buy-in for your leadership vision and for the idea that you should be the person to lead that vision. And so it will tend to involve negotiations with a broader range of players. So I imagine there's a huge diversity of career stages and career interests among the folks who are participating today. And so some of your negotiations may be about asking, for instance, for higher pay, about bending for some alternative relationship, or some of you may be contemplating your next leadership move, and you may be thinking about negotiating not just for something for yourself, but actually to persuade your organization or a set of people to do something new or different than they have done before. Okay. So I think we're gonna pause here before I move to my next section about thinking strategically, and I want to answer a few of the questions that have come up on the board. So let me look at these. So some of these, some of these are the questions that I'm thinking, examples are things like negotiating salary, how to say no to additional work. How to address bias and negotiating when re-entering full-time workforce after part-time during early motherhood. This is a really important one. And how do you suggest a woman of color navigate in a space that sometimes stereotypes you even before you speak? I'm like heading into all of these questions now. You know what I think I'm going to do? I'm going to, instead of I'm going to keep these questions in mind, and then as I go forward, I'm going to try to bring these examples into the conversation. I think that's the best way to address them. Okay, so we've got a number of specific examples that you guys clearly have in mind, and so what I want to talk about in this next segment is how do you think strategically in preparing for those negotiations. And I want you to think strategically about with whom you're going to be negotiating, what you're going to be negotiating, and then also how you will negotiate. And I've got two main things that I want you to keep in mind. And the first one is I'm going to advise you to reduce ambiguity. And I'm going to explain in two parts now why this is really important. So obviously, we look at this woman here, and none of us wants to go into a negotiation the way she looks right now. But I think for a lot of us, if we reflect back on some of our negotiations, we did go in looking like that. So what we did is we had an opportunity to speak up, and we just took it in an opportunistic kind of way, or when we went into the conversation, we really hadn't thought through all of our arguments, or maybe done as much homework as we could have done, or maybe we didn't fully understand our target. And so that's our target of influence or persuasion. And so that's what I want to talk about now. So there are three sources of ambiguity, as I've foreshadowed. There's ambiguity about with whom you're negotiating, and then also, I'll get into this, it's not just about, don't just think about your counterpart in the negotiation, who you're negotiating with, but also ambiguity that they may have about you. There's ambiguity about how to negotiate. So how should I approach this? You know, when's the appropriate time? What type of arguments should I make? Then there's the what is negotiable. And what I'm going to tell you right now is about the effects of ambiguity related to who, how, and what on gender effects in negotiation. So ambiguity about who heightens the potential for stereotypic attributions, right? And somebody raised this question of, I love this comment here, how do you suggest a woman of color navigate in a space that sometimes stereotypes you even before you speak? So this is exactly the type of thing that I'm talking about. When there's ambiguity, what we use, consciously or not, we will use indicators, demographic characteristics of the person with whom we're interacting to fill in the blanks of what do I expect from this person, okay? And so the ambiguity is really important. Ambiguity is important because you don't want to, I mean, one, you want to make the most persuasive case you can to that other person, but you and that other person, if you're not well known to that person, they could make stereotypic attributions about you. So one of the things that you want to think about is reducing that. What do you want to ask yourself, what do you want this person to know about you walking into that negotiation so that they're looking at you as an accomplished professional, or, you know, a stellar employee or an expert in a particular area, not as someone they're just trying to figure out as you sit across from them. So ambiguity about how is this, how should I approach the negotiation? Now, there is this women don't ask effect, but what particularly related to pay, I want to be careful that it's most of the evidence relates to pay negotiations, and I'm going to get into why that would be. But what research suggests is that this effect where women are more reluctant to negotiate or more relieved when a negotiation is over than men mostly will happen if the norms or the expectations about how to proceed in the negotiation are unclear. So I don't really know how to behave in this negotiation. I don't know whether there are pitfalls. Going back to that question, I don't know whether I'm being stereotyped or I'm going to be put in a box or what their expectations are for me. And the more ambiguity there is about how to proceed, the more likelihood that there are to be gender differences in the propensity to lean in and negotiate. Finally, ambiguity also heightens the potential for gender differences in negotiated outcomes. And I will explain why that is, but particularly in environments where, say, traditionally men have earned more than women or have been more likely to get promoted into particular types of roles or had received certain types of resources, those gendered norms within the environment have more potential to influence our outcomes in a negotiation when there's ambiguity about what are the appropriate standards for how this negotiation should be resolved. So let me move now to explain why ambiguity enhances gender effects. So it's not just the ambiguity itself. as this image suggests, what happens in ambiguity is that we're not exactly sure how to play the role that we're about to be asked to play. And so in ambiguity, there's just more potential for gendered information from the environment or gendered ideas inside our own heads or others to influence the negotiation. So there are two ways in which ambiguity enhances gender effects. One is through social networks. So social networks will influence your access to information, but also to career support. And if there is an environment in which one demographic group, say, dominates, well, let me start with this. It's all of us, for men and women, people of all different types of backgrounds, it's easier for us to connect with people who are like ourselves than people who are different. So go back to this idea. You're in an organizational context where the general population of the organization or the highest ranks of the organization tend to be dominated by one particular demographic group. People from that demographic group are just going to find it easier to make connections and friendships within that population, right? And so if women find themselves in a situation where they are at their rank in the minority or more senior folk, there are relatively few women on the ground at higher levels or at their peer level, they may have differential access to support or information in their negotiations. There's another thing that happens with social networks is, again, so we find it easier to connect with people who like ourselves. We also have a tendency to compare ourselves to people like ourselves. So as we're preparing for a negotiation, if men, let's say in an organization where men on average tend to be paid more than women, or in an industry or something like that, if men call their guy friends and ask, how much should I ask for my raise? And the women call their female friends. No discrimination necessarily involved, but if the men on average are paid more than the women, the men are going to come back with a higher number, a higher expectation of what they might be paid than the women would if they're just asking their women friends. So the key thing here is that social networks can also bias our search for information. So my key point here that you want to think about is not just relying on convenience networks in order to get your information. You want to reach out widely to make sure that you have the best information that you can find about what you should be expecting from the negotiation. And also think about reaching out widely in terms of potential supporters, or cultivating relationships with potential supporters if that's will require some more effort. The other reason why ambiguity will tend to influence gender effects in negotiation relates to gender stereotypes. So there are two different types of gender stereotypes. There are descriptive stereotypes, or what I like to call way they are stereotypes. We've got ideas about what men and women are good at and what they like. One stereotype related to that is that this idea that men are better negotiators than women. There is a social psychologist, Claude Steele, who is himself African American. He drew our attention to the phenomenon of stereotype threat, which is this very important finding that these stereotypes, even if we don't embrace them, so even if we don't believe men are better negotiators than women are, these stereotypes can still affect us. So he uses the example of being an African American man entering an ATM at night with a white woman at the monitor. And he says, I do not think because I am a black man that I am going to rob her, but I fear that she thinks that because I am a black man that I am going to rob her. And so just our knowledge of these stereotypes, even if we don't embrace them, can affect us. And so again, with a fair amount of ambiguity, we don't know how we're being viewed, or we don't know the person very well with whom we're negotiating. We may fear that we may not be perceived or expected to be an effective negotiator, or just be kind of taxed by this knowledge ourselves. Now, there's another type of stereotype which is called prescriptive stereotypes, or this idea of, I call them the way they should be stereotypes. And that is that we have stereotypes about the ideal man and the ideal woman. You know, not just what we think men and women are good at or what they do, but how they should behave. And one of the things that one of our prescriptive stereotypes, our way they should be stereotypes about women, is that women are fabulous advocates for others. They're great caregivers, and they put others before themselves. And so what happens particularly in pay negotiations, and again, pay negotiations are very masculine stereotyped. They're associated with a male breadwinner. They're also associated with, you know, making claim to high status resources. What we found in a number of studies is that when women self-advocate assertively for something, for like higher pay, people have this reaction like, she's not very nice, or she's awfully demanding, and they'll even be less inclined to work with her. Now, this is very important to show. I'm going to get onto some good news in a minute, but this is very important to show because this is these way they should be stereotypes. This potential for backlash if a woman asserts herself for higher pay is the leading explanation of why women are more hesitant to negotiate for higher pay than men are. It's not about women's lack of confidence or lack of skill. It is primarily about women accurately reading the social environment and therefore being more hesitant to negotiate. So I think this is just a really important thing to keep in mind, lest I worry, create the stereotypes that we're trying to combat by presenting women as not great negotiators. Women are fabulous negotiators on behalf of others. I'm giving away my next slide, less so than on their own behalf. So this is a study that we did among others, and other labs and researchers have done about similar effects, where we had people in a lab and we put them either in the position of negotiating for themselves or negotiating for somebody else for higher pay. And there's myself and other conditions. And for men, and we did check with them that they understood whether they were negotiating for themselves or others. That made no difference in their performance in the negotiation. But for women, they did significantly better when they were negotiating for others than for themselves. Now, candidly, I love showing this slide because it's taken from a study with a group of executives, and the women negotiating for others did better than anybody else in the negotiation. It's not always the case. The relative level of the bars for women as compared to the men sometimes shift, so that sometimes, you know, men and women do equally well negotiating on behalf of others, but maybe women do less well than men negotiating for themselves. But the effect that replicates again and again is that women, particularly around things like pay, will do significantly better advocating for others than for themselves. So I want you to remember this. This goes back to women are fabulous negotiators. There are just these conditions, the conditions under which we're likely to get gender effects favoring men are when there's a lot of ambiguity, when women are self-advocating, and particularly then what they're negotiating over is masculine stereotyped. And so that's why we get these effects in the pay negotiations. Okay, so in your next negotiation, what I want to challenge you to do is to think about how will you reduce ambiguity. How will you reduce ambiguity about what is negotiable? So what could you potentially negotiate, and what are appropriate standards about what you could walk away with? There's a question about how to negotiate. How would you approach this particular person? When's the appropriate time? How do you bring it up? And then who is negotiating? Not just you want to know with clarity, not you also thinking about what do you want people to know with clarity about you, as well as what do you want to know about your negotiating counterparts. So before I move to the next section, I want to, so I'm getting this, again, I want to go back to this question about how to address, so I've got a couple of questions related to bias and negotiating when re-entering full-time workforce after part-time, and also, again, like women coming out and getting back in. And I think this is so critically important, right? There is very good evidence that moms are stereotyped related to their competence or their loyalty to the organization. And so you want to think about that if they're related to the ambiguity about who, right? So what is a way, as you think about negotiating your way back into organizations, you can reduce ambiguity in terms of what it is that you would bring to the organization in terms of your competencies or your talents, or, you know, very specifically, what would you contribute? You want to think about references, people who will speak for you, that will give an image of you as the type of worker you'd like to be seen as by the organization. Now, this may also require, some people are lucky enough to step out and then step back in full force. But for a lot of people, they'll do some interim work. They'll build up, they'll do projects, they'll take on a particular role, and so they'll, through those, through that kind of staged re-entry, they're reducing that ambiguity about their potential contributions and demonstrating their potential as a worker. Now, again, if you're stepping out and going back into the organization, you may not have good clarity about what it is that you could potentially negotiate within the organization. And I know also because I have a lot of friends, Harvard College alumni included, who have stepped out of the workforce for a while and are there. These are super talented women thinking about how to get back in. And part of what they want to negotiate is to figure out, like, how am I going to do this? How am I going to fulfill my aspirations to be, say, the mom that I want to be, or the caregiver for my parents that I want to be, and fulfill my aspirations to be a really effective professional? So again, you want to use your network. I mean, I would try to get as much clarity as you can from, you know, informational interviews initially, or, you know, working your networks inside of organizations. What is, like, realistic that you could negotiate that will help you achieve your aspirations? Then again, also, like, how to negotiate. I'm going to get into this actually now in my next section, so I'm going to hold on that. Looking to see if there's any suggestions for creatively negotiating promotion, new title, increased pay or responsibility outside the typical performance evaluation deadline. So this is a great example of a bending negotiation, right? So again, I think what you want to do is go in and think about that. We'll stick with the ambiguity reduction, but I'm going to talk to this more in terms of relationships. You know, actually, I'm going to hold that. I'm going to get to this now. It makes more sense after I provide this next piece of information. So my first thing that I wanted you to keep in mind was reduce ambiguity. Reduce ambiguity about who, what, and how you're going to negotiate, okay, or with whom. And then my second piece is I'm going to suggest that you enhance your negotiations through relationships and your relationships through negotiations, okay? And let me explain what I mean by that. So in terms of enhancing your negotiations through relationships, this relates to what I was just talking about, right? Who could help you get information about what is negotiable or what the negotiating norms are? Who could give you, you know, advice in your negotiation? Who could give you social support or be an advocate? So what I have in mind for being an advocate is someone who could give you a reference or call ahead for you, or, you know, set you up for that conversation. Argue that you would be a great person to hire. Maybe it's just for a project, or maybe it's actually for a position opening. But it's social support. Social support is really hard, and I think it really, not hard, but really important. And again, I'm thinking of, we've got a number of questions about, you know, difficult situations in the workplace. So people who want to get places that they don't feel like they know how to get there, or people who are trying to make their way back in. I mean, it's really important that we think about the folks that will help us feel more resilient. There's actually research showing that when we're more powerful we feel, the more likely we are to take action. And one of the ways that we're more likely to take action is to negotiate. So I strongly encourage you to think about, like, who are your partners? Like, think of that image of all those women in those negotiation programs, you know, cheering each other on. Having people who will help you maintain your resilience while you're working through this difficult negotiation is really important. But another element of social support is also somebody who will help you role play the arguments that you might make. And this is really important and relates to this next point that I'm going to get in, because it can be hard for us. It takes some practice to generate really persuasive arguments that will appeal to the other side. So Actually, before I get to the persuasive arguments, I want to go back again to the strategies, right? So one important thing about, you may imagine that you're asking, but related to getting information, make sure you actually know what's in that vending machine. You may think that you're bending when it's actually you're negotiating for something that other people have gotten. So you want to use your network to make sure that you understand the full range of opportunities that are available within the context that you're negotiating. Again, for bending opportunities, if you think about your network, you may need people who will really speak up for your value as an employee if you want to negotiate an alternative arrangement. What the research suggests is that the employees are more likely to get what's called like an individualized deal, an individualized negotiated employment arrangement if they are perceived as high value employees. So maybe there are people who could be your advocates or supporters in helping you negotiate that alternative arrangement. Now, shaping, again, is likely to involve negotiations with a whole range of people. And so if you're in approaching a broad leadership negotiation like that, you want to think about not just about people who can advise or support you, but about building a whole coalition of support for people who are bought into you. Okay, so now I want to go back to this question of how to be persuasive. And that's where I flip around you want to think about enhancing your negotiations through your relationships, but you also want to think about enhancing your relationships through negotiations. So what you want to do, going back to that social support and someone who could role play the negotiation with you, what you want is advice on how to persuade your negotiating counterpart, your target of influence, why it's legitimate for you to be negotiating, and also why what you're asking for is not just good for you, but it's also good for them, or it's good for the company, or good for some larger cause that you both believe in. And so, as suggested by this image, it really takes stepping out of your own perspective and getting into the perspective of the other party. And that is where we often, particularly if we're feeling emotional or threatened or kind of upset about something, that's where it's really important to get somebody else who can advise us on how to take the other side's perspective. I'll give you one example quickly of a woman who told me that she discovered for the second time that she had a male subordinate who was being paid more than she was. And you can imagine she had a lot of things that she would like to say to the people who had negotiated that arrangement. But what she ended up doing after some reflection was she went back into the organization and she said to them, you know, I know that you're going to agree with me that this is not appropriate, that this kind of violates our company's policies and norms, and that this isn't good for my potential effectiveness as a leader. So I know that you're going to want to fix this problem. So it's a question of getting beyond all of our impassioned reasons for what we want to really thinking about what can we say to the other side that will be persuasive to them. And again, it's not that her frustration or anger or sense of injustice in that moment was not entirely legitimate reasons for her to negotiate, but the question is, what is she going to make salient to the other side that will make her persuasive? So this is an idea that actually Sheryl Sandberg picked up in her Lean In book. And I had the opportunity to engage with Sheryl when she was writing the book, and she, to her credit, called up and said, listen, I know what I do and the advice that I give, but I have no idea whether it has any evidence basis. And she was describing her own strategy, and I was actually able to say, well, we've got this research going on, and actually what you're suggesting is exactly what we are finding both helps women get what they want and helps them avoid that backlash that they are legitimately concerned about. And I want to summarize that strategy as what I call I-we. And I'll give you this example from Sheryl Sandberg's book. So she says that she's negotiating with Facebook about taking on the COO position. She gets offered a deal, and then I don't remember if it was her husband or her brother-in-law or somebody says to her, you have to negotiate compensation. I mean, you just cannot just accept this. And so she comes up with how and she said she was actually a little concerned about this, even in spite of the fact that she's obviously was highly desired and, you know, a potentially elite hire. But so what she said is the argument that she made was, of course you realize that you're hiring me to run your deal team, so you want me to be a good negotiator. Okay, this is a great line related to legitimacy, because if the person you're hiring to run your deal team isn't negotiating, then you're hiring the wrong person. But then she says, well, this will be the only time you and I will ever be on opposite sides of the table. And that's where she also reaches out to make that connection with the other person, of getting into the we mode. Now, I'm not suggesting any of these scripts in particular. You have to figure out what is authentic to you. But this also just jibes with the best negotiating advice. As you enter these negotiations, you want to think, again, not just about why this is important to you, but why the person on the other side will see your negotiating as legitimate, and then also why they will see it as in their interest or the company's interest to go along with what you're proposing. And this is whether you're asking or bending or shaping a new leadership opportunity. So entering your next negotiation, I would encourage you to ask yourself, how could you enhance your negotiation through relationships and your relationships through negotiation? So you want to tap your relationships or build relationships that will enhance your capacity to get critical information, advice, social support, or advocacy. But then you also want to think about, as you make your negotiating pitch, why will the person you're negotiating with perceive your negotiating as legitimate, and how will they recognize the win-wins? Why does it make sense to them, their company, or some larger effort that you're striving for? So let me wrap up with these final points, and then I want to move to see if I can answer a few of these questions. So negotiation, I will propose to you, as a critical tool in advancing your career aspirations and leadership goals. And as you think about what to negotiate, you want to think, are you asking for something standard? Are you asking for something exceptional? Are you negotiating something strategic for which you need broad buy-in? And then I would urge you to prepare strategically. Prepare strategically by reducing ambiguity, and then again, enhancing your negotiations through your relationships and your relationships through your negotiations. So in the time we have left, let me move to some of these great questions that we have up here. How can we change the perception backlash seems so core to negotiating? This is a really tough one. The stereotypes about men being paid more than women, or that men will tend to ascend to leadership more often than women, are actually a reflection of our society. So people expect men to be paid more than women, or to be in leaderships more often than women, because that's when we look around, that's what we see. And so this goes back to the negotiating for yourself or negotiating for somebody else. I mean, when you are successful advocating for yourself, when you are successful negotiating for, high and fair compensation, or when you are successful ascending into an organization, you are not just doing this for yourself. You are truly paving the path for other women. I had a participant in an executive program who was mid-senior level within one of the U.S. intelligence agencies, and she said that as she was coming up the ranks, there was this idea, there was this taken for granted notion that when that women who had children only reached a certain level within the organization. And then she said that she was promoted with children above that level. And when she achieved that, when she managed to negotiate her path into that position, she shattered that expectation. And so now we loosen the stereotypes. We will loosen the backlash, and we will loosen the stereotypes by getting more women into higher paid positions and more women into leadership positions. And that's kind of the key. So let me think. What about pursuing training opportunities when these are limited by budget constraints? Okay, that's a really legitimate question. One, there are great negotiation books out there. Ones that I would strongly suggest, particularly if you're thinking about shaping, there's a great book by Lax and Sabanius called 3D Negotiating, which is not just about what you do at the table, but how do you shape the conditions for success at the negotiating table. Lee Thompson has a fabulous book called The Heart and Mind of the Negotiator that reviews a lot of research about about negotiation, and then also has really great advice in it. There's a book by Deepak Malhotra and Max Bazerman called Negotiating Genius. And while it's a bold title, there's some truth to it. They've got some great advice in that book. And actually their advice about things like pay negotiations or job negotiations is very similar to what I would suggest. Mine's just also informed by this, how do we overcome some of the gender-related barriers? So I'm looking to see if we've got, one question is here is, aren't negotiations highly private? So how do you have advocates contact your associates you're negotiating with in an appropriate way? Okay, so that's going to depend on the context. And I think the biggest thing that you need to do is that may be starting with advice, right? So it sounds like that's a situation where the how to negotiate is ambiguous. And so what you might want to do is just sit down and have a conversation with folks about, you know, how should I go about this? Or how do people get opportunities like that? I was actually at a conference recently and a woman said, you know, I'm in an organizational context. She was a woman of color. She said, I'm in an organizational context. I'm seeing people with the same or less qualifications than I have getting an opportunity that I would really like to have, but I'm sitting here and I'm not asking for it. And I guess I'm fulfilling the stereotype, but I don't know what to do. And I don't feel like I'm afraid of backlash if I just assert myself and say, you should let me do this too. And so as she and I were strategizing, we talked about, don't worry about starting out by asking for this. You can just start off by asking for information. You can start off by having some conversations. Wow, I thought it was so great that so-and-so had this opportunity. How do you do that? Like, how does somebody get one of those opportunities around here? And so you don't need to be, that's actually what Jim Sabanius, who wrote 3D Negotiation, calls it a non-offer offer. There are ways of kind of putting things on the table where you don't need to come out boldly and ask for them directly, but you can start a conversation that will help you reduce ambiguity and then potentially open the door to a negotiating opportunity. I think somebody also earlier said something about what do you do when people are asking you, like, how do you negotiate no? So what if people are just the opposite case? So with the example I was just using was a woman who wanted to do something and then wasn't getting the opportunity. There are also a lot of situations where women find themselves, men also, but women will find themselves in a situation where they're being asked to do work that they don't want to do. A common thing is you're the fixer. Oh, good, we'll put her in there because she'll be able to solve that. Or if there's a problem among employees, she'll be the person who manages the conflict or something like that. And so what you can find yourself is being put in these roles or these fix-it situations or jobs that aren't actually leading you where you want to go. It's that yes, you might be good at that, but that's not where your passion is or your aspiration. And so again, I think it goes back to that, how when you negotiate with your organization, do you make the argument that when you make a proposal about what you want to do, to make the case about why you would be a really good person to do that. Now, I don't suggest threatening to leave as a way to persuade people. Unfortunately, sometimes we get to that situation. But what Roger Fisher, who is a famous negotiation professor from Harvard Law School, used to say is that you want to keep your alternatives to agreement in your back pocket. So if you are in a situation where you're being asked to do stuff repeatedly that you don't want to do, and you would like to be doing something different, I do think it makes sense to explore what your alternatives look like. And that, at a minimum, will give you more confidence in your negotiation in asking what you want. And if necessary, you may need to go and find a different environment in which you can thrive. So again, I would think about, you know, your negotiating position is strengthened by your alternatives to negotiation. And so you want to think about building those up and then keeping them in your back pocket as you negotiate, and really only use them if you have to. But your confidence about what your alternatives are should buoy you in the negotiation. I think we're running the end of our hour. We've just got 1 minute. Can you negotiate around your direct manager if there's not support? I think you got to work your network. You know, develop a broader range of relationships. And how to negotiate in environments with a lot of competitions in the gig economy. Okay, that's the last thing. There's a lot of women, and there's a lot of women who also have stepped out of traditional employment who are working in the gig economy. I think this is a really important, there's a lot of ambiguity in the gig economy. The gig economy gives us a lot of flexibility, which is a great thing, but it also puts us in a situation where we have to repeatedly self-advocate for compensation and opportunities in ambiguity. So I think it's really important to reduce that ambiguity, particularly in those types of negotiations, and be conscious about the potential implications of that. So I think we are now at the end of our hour, and I hope you have enjoyed our exchange. I have really appreciated your comments and questions, and I hope we might have another opportunity to engage virtually or in person. Thank you.